Seamus McCormick here, President of the Goldsmith Literary Festival. At the conclusion of this audio presentation, Arthur Conlon will give you the background and tell you more about this festival. Its roots are in the Goldsmith Summer School, which dates back to 1985. We had two aims in mind. One, to encourage study and continued awareness of the works of Oliver Goldsmith. We felt he was often overlooked, although he is among the greats of English literature of the 18th century. He is celebrated as an essayist, a dramatist and a poet, and the Literary Festival brings these works to life to a new audience every year. Our second aim is to promote the literary and historical heritage of Goldsmith Country in South Westmeath and Longford as a tourism attraction. And our festival has continued to grow and develop and remains relevant thanks to the work of an enthusiastic committee. Using this heritage and literary audio trail, you will trace Oliver Goldsmith's early life in this region of South Westmeath. We are proud of the heritage of our lyrical sounding place names of Auburn, Lissoy, Kilkenny West, the Pigeons and the Hawthorn Bush. You will learn how his early life experiences here influenced his most famous works, in particular the poem The Deserted Village. Today your starting point is the Three Jolly Pigeons. You will hear that a nailhouse bearing this name features in Goldsmith's play She Stoops to Conquer, where it is toasted in song as a place of merriment. Thank you for visiting us and enjoy your heritage and literary trail here in South Westmeath.
So welcome again to Goldsmith Country. Your trail today in the Irish Midlands has 5 stops, all centred on the area that inspired Oliver Goldsmith in many of his later writings. While many 18th century writers have long been forgotten, Goldsmith's works have never been out of print. His play, She Stoops to Conquer, continues to be performed, and his works are studied in schools, colleges and universities around the world. He's as popular and relevant today as he was 250 years ago. Perhaps this is because Goldsmith remains unique among 18th century writers in that he wrote an acknowledged masterpiece in the 3 main literary genres: the novel, The Vicar of Wakefield, 1766, the poem, The Deserted Village, 1770, and the play, She Stoops to Conquer, 1773. At various points on the trail, you will hear from Professor Michael Griffin of University Limerick, a leading expert on Goldsmith. On your journey, you will discover the places that shaped his imagination and continue to reflect the Ireland he immortalised in verse and comedy.
Hello, I'm Professor Michael Griffin from the University of Limerick. I've long been interested in the writings of Oliver Goldsmith, and currently with colleagues in Britain and Ireland, we've been editing a new edition of Goldsmith's works for Cambridge University Press, over 8 volumes. One of the things that's always interested critics and scholars of Goldsmith's work is the extent to which his Irish background inflects his writings, because by and large he's writing for an English audience in his own time. He doesn't return to Ireland after he leaves it in 1752, and he has a very intense and intensive literary career between 1757 and 1774, but never really explicitly writes about Ireland. But he has been a tremendously important figure in the history of Irish writing. Therefore, Irish critics, and some British critics as well, have always sought to ascertain the extent of the influence of his own upbringing in rural Longford, Westmeath, Roscommon, to specifically his Deserted Village, but also to try and find traces of his Irishness in works such as She Stoops to Conquer or The Vicar of Wakefield. So in the initial decades after Goldsmith's passing, Irish people would have cherished his work, but English critics weren't necessarily convinced of the Irishness of it. However, with the Romantics and with some of the new emphasis that came into the literary sphere towards the end of the 18th century, the early 19th century, there was an increasing emphasis on place, a sense of place that informed a poet's writings. So that led more and more British observers to think about the possible Irish origins of Goldsmith's most famous poems. And one such person was R.H. Newell, who came to Ireland in the early part of the 19th century, in the first decade of the 19th century, and he compiled his own edition of the poetical works of Oliver Goldsmith, in which he researched extensively notes on the locations in and around Ballymahon, Lissoy and Pallas, which have corresponding sections in the Deserted Village. Not only did he do his research and interview local people, he also sketched scenes from the poem, and those sketches correspond quite closely to the scenes of the poem that we can still recognise on our tour today.
We start here at the Three Jolly Pigeons, which was built over 200 years ago. Originally, it was a single-storey thatched pub. The two-storey residence was added in the early 1900s. It is a listed building, and the thatched pub section has been retained faithful to the original building. Between 1807 and 1809, the Reverend R.H. Newell, Fellow of St. John's College, Cambridge, made drawings of the sights and scenes associated with Goldsmith's poem, The Deserted Village. His publication, The Poetical Works of Oliver Goldsmith, was published in 1811, and it featured illustrative engravings by Samuel Alkin, based on Newell's drawings. A small collection of prints of Alkin's works is on display in the pub. Tradition has it that the pub doorstep incorporates the millstone from The Busy Mill, referred to in the poem The Deserted Village. The Three Jolly Pigeons takes its name from the public house that provided the setting for Act 1, Scene 2 of Oliver Goldsmith's well-known play She Stoops to Conquer. A drinking song celebrating good liquor and good company is sung by Tony Lumpkin in the village inn. The first verse celebrates drinking alcohol, while the second verse pokes fun at Methodist preachers who were against drinking. Let schoolmasters puzzle their brain with grammar and nonsense and learning. Good liquor, I stoutly maintain, gives genius a better discerning. Let them brag of their heathenish gods, their leathers, their Styxes and Stygians, their quiss and their quays and their quads. They're all but a parcel of pigeons, to ruddle, to ruddle, to roll. When Methodist preachers come down, a-preaching that drinking is sinful, I'll wager the rascals a crown. They'll always preach best with a skinful, but when you come down with your pence for a slice of their scurvy religion, I leave it to all men of sense, but you, my good friend, are the pigeon. To ruddle, to ruddle, to roll. Then come put the jorum about, and let us be merry and clever. Our hearts and our liquors are stout. Here's the Three Jolly Pigeons forever. Let some cry up woodcock or hare, your bustards, your ducks and your widgeons, but of all the birds in the air, here's a health to the Three Jolly Pigeons. To ruddle, to ruddle, to roll. The location of the original Three Jolly Pigeons tavern, referred to in the play, is believed to be near your final stop on this tour, by the hawthorn bush. Sadly, nothing remains of it today. The next stop will be a very short drive away, to the left as you leave here, and watch out for the signpost marking a right turn off the main road. Today there is no visible remains of the schoolhouse where the young Oliver was a student. When Oliver was 2 years old, his father was appointed the rector of the parish of Kilkenny West, which will be our fourth stop on this tour. The family moved to the parsonage at Lissoy in 1730 and continued to live there until his father's death in 1747, 17 years later. The parish offered a better living standard than his previous parish of Forgney in County Longford. Oliver was the fifth child of 8. His father's earnings at that time were £200 per annum. Oliver's education started at the age of 4 in Lissoy, where his first teacher, Elizabeth Delap, described him as being dull and apparently stupid. However, he was adept at composing short rhymes. His parents realised he was the cleverest of the children. His wit was quick, but so was his temper. At the age of 6, he was sent to school at this location. His teacher was Thomas Byrne, a former soldier. He was a strict disciplinarian, but had a broad knowledge of adventurous stories of heroic myths, tales of highwaymen, pirates, outlaws and shipwrecks that would have stimulated his students, including Oliver. The following lines from The Deserted Village describe him as a disciplinarian of stern appearance, yet their fear of his punishments is contrasted with his hidden kindness and love for knowledge. Beside yon straggling fence that skirts the way, with blossomed firs unprofitably gay, there in his noisy mansion, skilled to rule, the village master taught his little school. A man severe he was, and stern to view. I knew him well, and every truant knew. Well had the boding tremblers learned to trace the day's disasters in his morning face. Full well they laughed with counterfeited glee at all his jokes, for many a joke had he. Full well the busy whisper, circling round, conveyed the dismal tidings when he frowned. Yet he was kind, or if severe in aught, the love he bore to learning was in fault. Scholars tell us that this poem reflects the Enlightenment's emphasis on education, and we can see the social hierarchy prevalent during the 18th century. The schoolmaster is a big presence in the village, in an age when literacy and numeracy were powerful things, when many were illiterate and innumerate. Then the rustics, the ordinary working-class people of the village, look up to the school teacher. He seems a kind of god. The second part refers to his knowledge, the fact he can survey fields and work out boundaries. Of course, this is all ironic. The school teacher isn't that knowledgeable. He just seems very knowledgeable to the gazing rustics, a figure of authority, despite his limited knowledge. The poem's concise and direct language presents a realistic portrayal of a rural setting and characters of the time. The village all declared how much he knew. 'Twas certain he could write and cipher too. Lands he could measure, terms and tides presage, and e'en the story ran that he could gauge. In arguing too, the parson owned his skill, for e'en though vanquished he could argue still, while words of learned length and thundering sound amazed the gazing rustics ranged around. And still they gazed, and still the wonder grew, that one small head could carry all he knew. But past is all his fame. The very spot where many a time he triumphed is forgot. The poem is both an affectionate portrait of a revered personality and a reflection on learning and social change. In his 8th year, Oliver contracted smallpox, a deadly disease at that time. He survived, but it left him with facial scars for life. He attended the diocesan Latin school in Elphin, County Roscommon, where he stayed with his Uncle John. During his studies, he became adept at translation. From 1741 to 1744, he studied under the Reverend Patrick Hughes at Edgeworthstown, County Longford. At the age of 16, he entered Trinity College Dublin to study theology and law. At the entrance to Trinity College today, you will see a large statue of Oliver Goldsmith by the renowned sculptor John Henry Foley. The Busy Mill. The phrase, the busy mill, appears in The Deserted Village as part of a description of the tranquil, idealized rural village. The full line reads, "The never-failing brook, the busy mill," and continues to describe the sheltered cot, the cultivated farm, the decent church that topped the neighbouring hill. The decent church being Kilkenny West Church. Goldsmith uses the image of the mill to represent the idyllic, productive and harmonious rural life that has been lost due to the corrupting influence of the wealthy and the fact of rural depopulation. The mill, along with other images of a pastoral landscape like the brook and the farm, are symbols of the traditional way of life and the flourishing community in the village of Auburn before its decline. The busy mill was situated further up this road, past where the schoolhouse once was. Again, sadly, nothing remains of it today. Sweet Auburn, loveliest village of the plain, where health and plenty cheered the labouring swain, where smiling spring its earliest visit paid, and parting summer's lingering blooms delayed. Lissoy is believed to be the Auburn mentioned in the opening lines from The Deserted Village, evoking a beautiful and prosperous village, emphasising its community spirit and idyllic rural life. The parsonage where his father served as rector was his childhood home. He fondly recalls the village of his youth as a place of simple happiness, contrasting its vibrant past with the subsequent desolation brought about by economic changes and depopulation. There are only partial remains of the two-storey building that was Oliver's home between 1730 and 1747 visible today. He considered Lissoy to be the only home he ever knew.
So, what Goldsmith did take away from Ireland, and what he sought to infuse his work with, was a love of rural manners and mirth, the pleasing culture of the countryside, understood in the pastoral sense, When we think of pastoral, of course, we think of the tending of sheep and of agricultural labour. We think of the long tradition of pastoral verse, classical poets such as Virgil. But we also think of the pastoral image of the paternal clergyman, the shepherd in the spiritual sense, tending to his flock. In Goldsmith's case, obviously the figure of his father, a clergyman, can be seen to be central in his work. The Reverend Charles Goldsmith married Anne Jones, who was herself the daughter of the Reverend Oliver Jones, master of the diocesan school at Elphin. Charles succeeded to the rectory in Kilkenny West in 1730 and then went to live in the parsonage. Goldsmith's beloved uncle, Thomas Contarine, was also a clergyman. So Goldsmith was surrounded by fatherly clergyman figures in his rural upbringing. The centrality of the church is evident in the figure of the Vicar of Wakefield, just as the figure of the preacher is so important in the deserted village. And it's hard not to think that these figures are based to a certain extent, if not fully, on people such as his father and his much beloved brother Henry, to whom he would dedicate his other great famous poem, The Traveller, and whom he took as an example throughout his life. Henry was also a clergyman, so the culture of the Anglican Church is something that Goldsmith would have been immersed in throughout his youth, and he may even have been a clergyman himself if an interview with the Bishop of Elphin had gone better. But thankfully for literary posterity, that didn't work out, and Goldsmith became a writer.
In a letter written by Oliver to his brother-in-law Daniel Hodson, who was living in the parsonage at the time, he remembers Lissoy as he writes, "If I go to the opera, I sit and sigh as I remember for Lissoy's Fireside and Johnny Armstrong's Last Good Night from Peggy Golden. If I climb Hampstead Hill, where nature never exhibited a more magnificent prospect, I find it fine, but then I would rather be placed on the little mound before Lissoy Gate, and there take in the most pleasing horizon in nature." The letter was written as he was only beginning to establish himself as a writer in London, and he is obviously reminiscing about home. In Goldsmith's time, it was probably possible to see his father's church at Kilkenny West on the horizon from the little mound before Lissoy Gate. The reference to Johnny Armstrong's Last Good Night from Peggy Golden was to a song at the time. An extract from The Deserted Village also describes his father. "Near yonder copse where once the garden smiled, and still where many a garden flower grows wild, there where a few torn shrubs the place disclose, the village preacher's modest mansion rose. A man he was to all the country dear, and passing rich with £40 a year. Remote from towns he ran his godly race, nor e'er had changed, nor wished to change his place. Unpractised he to fawn, or seek for power, by doctrines fashioned to the varying hour. Far other aims his heart had learned to prize, more skilled to raise the wretched than to rise. His house was known to all the vagrant train. He chid their wanderings, but relieved their pain. The long-remembered beggar was his guest, whose beard descending swept his aged breast. The ruined spendthrift, now no longer proud, claimed kindred there, and had his claims allowed. The broken soldier, kindly bade to stay, sat by his fire and talked the night away. Wept o'er his wounds, or tales of sorrow done, shouldered his crutch, and showed how fields were won. Pleased with his guests, the good man learned to glow, and quite forget the vices in their woe. Careless their merits or their faults to scan, his pity gave ere charity began." Our next stop is the decent church at Kilkenny West. How often I have paused on every charm, the sheltered cot, the cultivated farm, the never-failing brook, the busy mill, the decent church that topped the neighbouring hill, the hawthorn bush, with seats beneath the shade. Lines again from the opening section of The Deserted Village set the scene here at the decent church. The present church, St. Canice's, which dates from 1839, was designed by Joseph Welland, who had sole responsibility for the design of all Church of Ireland churches in Leinster at that time. Oliver's father, the Reverend Charles Goldsmith, was appointed curate here in 1730, until his death in 1747, and is buried here. The church may incorporate an earlier church, dating from 1550, An old mortuary chapel dating back to 1680 is situated in the far right of the graveyard, and we can see its intact stone roof.
So the decent church has been identified by Newell in his commentary as the church in Kilkenny West. There was no church in Lissoy, where Goldsmith's father had been curate. So the church in the poem is, as Newell says, exactly described as seen from Lissoy, the residence of the preacher, who in this reading is Goldsmith's brother Henry. There is no monument to their memory, concluded Newell, but it is well known that Goldsmith's father and brother are buried in this church. In the vicinity of the church, we can see that we are not very far removed from the town of Ballymore in Westmeath, which was the place of origin of another poet by the name of Lawrence White, whose description of country matters and national grievances were very well known in the Dublin of Goldsmith's Trinity years. Those poems were published in 1740 and 1741 and were of interest to those involved in the culture of music in Dublin, specifically around Fishamble Street, where of course the Messiah, Handel's Messiah, was first performed. Lawrence White's greatest poetic achievement is a poem called The Parting Cup, or The Humours of Jock Durish, in 4 cantos, which is a wonderful evocation of life in this part of the world, a brilliant and witty portrayal of a farmer's life around 1710. There is much in the poem which anticipates and may have influenced Goldsmith's perspectives in the deserted village. White describes how contemporary developments in agriculture and land ownership were depopulating every village where we had husbandry and tillage. The lands are all monopolised, the tenants racked and sacrificed, whole colonies to shun the fate of being oppressed at such a rate, by tyrants who still raise their rent, sail to the western continent. Rather than live at home like slaves, they trust themselves to wind and waves. So a poet from Goldsmith's own region was addressing some of the same topics that Goldsmith addressed in The Deserted Village. And we can see that the poem is, not just in terms of its locales, but also in terms of its ideas and in terms of some of the political changes that it addresses, a product of its locality.
There were 4 churches on this site prior to the building you see today. St. Canice visited here in the 6th century and started a monastery with a small church. In the 12th century, the Dillon family, who brought in the Franciscans, built another church. The term Dillon's country was used to refer to the extensive tracts of land that were owned by the family, including the barony of Kilkenny West. The Dillons who had arrived with the Normans were landlords in Westmeath and Roscommon. The Dillons became adroit over the years, supporting at various times the different factions ruling Ireland, and only sold their estates in the late 19th century. The church today, as mentioned, replaced an earlier Protestant church, circa 1550. A young Oliver was perhaps sometimes bored by his father's sermons because he is reputed to have written this short poem during one having spotted a rat in the belfry. A pious rat for want of stairs came down a rope to say his prayers. Next stop will be that of the hawthorn bush. Turn right as you leave the church. The hawthorn bush with seats beneath the shade, for talking age and whispering lovers made. As with the opening lines of The Deserted Village, Goldsmith's imagery continues to evoke a sense of nostalgia for simpler times. The hawthorn bush represents a symbol of community and a timeless aspect of rural life. It serves as a central meeting point for villagers, facilitating conversations among the elderly and romantic exchanges between lovers.
The location of the hawthorn bush would have been known to the locals in Goldsmith's own time and in the generation following. But R.H. Newell was the first scholar, if you like, to make that information available to an English readership. And he was interested in the fact that, in the first instance, Goldsmith chose this particular species of tree and to notice it repeatedly. And he says that grow they certainly do in different parts of Lissoy, and that's supposed to be described here, and which is shown as such, stands about 100 yards from the site of the original public house on the left side of the Ballymahon Road. It is one of the largest, but now decaying, and mutilated by pieces of it being often carried away as relics. The seats beneath it, now there no longer, fix its situation with some probability. In England, at least, they are not unusual near village alehouses. What Newell here is addressing is the fact that the poem was popular with English audiences who, even though they objected to some of its economic arguments, sought to project and to imagine certain aspects of its scenery in an English setting. And such was the case with the hawthorn bush. However, to an Irish audience, the location of the hawthorn bush was quite specific, and specific to the extent that it would actually become almost fetishized by 19th century readers of the poem, who would, as Newell remarks, take away swatches from the bush over the decades following the poem's publication.
The alehouse, which is referred to in She Stoops to Conquer, was situated just across the road here at the hawthorn bush. It is believed to have inspired the scene where in the play the character Tony Lumpkin leads two lost travellers to an alehouse, also referred to as the Three Pigeons, as we mentioned at the start, believing it is a manor house. This concludes our visit to 5 sites in Westmeath related to Oliver Goldsmith and his works. If you would like to explore more, head back into Ballymahon, home to the annual Goldsmith Festival, which is held during the June bank holiday weekend. Visit the Goldsmith Reading Room in Ballymahon Community Library. In the centre of the town, you will see Goldsmith's statue, a bronze by sculptor Eamon O'Doherty.
Hello and welcome to Goldsmith Country. My name is Arthur Conlon and I'm chairman of the Goldsmith Festival, a unique social, cultural and literary event established in 1985 with the aim of preserving the legacy of Oliver Goldsmith's life and works. The Goldsmith Festival was established in 1985 and takes place every June bank holiday over 3 days, centred here in Ballymahon. Oliver Goldsmith was born very close to here in Pallas. As an Irishman from rural Ireland, he became one of the most important literary figures in 18th century London. Many writers from the 18th century have long been forgotten, but Goldsmith's legacy is very much current and alive. And the amazing thing in reading Goldsmith's works are how much of it is still relevant today. In fact, the Goldsmith Festival that I spoke about earlier takes as its theme a current topic and looks at it through the eyes of Goldsmith. And the wisdom and the knowledge that we can learn from looking at these current topics through Goldsmith's eyes is enormous.
Travel on to Ardagh, a beautiful heritage village, and Pallas, the birthplace of Goldsmith. Visit St. Munice's Church in Forgney and see the stained glass window with a brass plaque erected in 1897, inscribed to the glory of God and in memory of Oliver Goldsmith, poet, novelist, playwright, born in this parish, of which his father was for 12 years curate. This window was erected by lovers of the man and his genius. Thank you for visiting the Goldsmith Trail. Enjoy your literary travels. The Heritage Council and Westmeath County Council have funded and supported the development of this digital heritage trail.